April 12th, 1945. 06:17 hours, somewhere over the Elbe River, eastern Germany. The Bau 47. Thunderbolt carves through the morning mist at 300 feet, its Pratt & Whitney radial engine hammering the cold air into submission. Captain Thomas "Tommy" Hayes leans forward against his harness, scanning the river below for the bridge. Just the bridge. That was the briefing. Reconnaissance sweep of the Torgau crossing, photograph the span, assess damage from yesterday's bomber strike, return to base with film. 30 minutes. No engagement unless absolutely necessary. The war is nearly over, and no one wants to be the last man killed for a bridge that will be in Allied hands within a week anyway. But Hayes sees something else. Through a gap in the tree line, 300 yards south of the bridge, a clearing emerges from the fog. And in that clearing, arranged in 2 neat rows like toys on a child's bedroom floor, sit 9 German aircraft. Not fighters. These are larger, twin-engine machines with the distinctive glazed noses of bombers or reconnaissance planes. Ju-88s, perhaps, or He 811s. They are parked, wingtip to wingtip, unprotected, unhidden, seemingly abandoned in the chaos of the Reich's final collapse. No revetments, no camouflage netting, no visible ground crew, just 9 aircraft sitting in the open dawn, waiting. Hayes makes 2 passes to confirm what he is seeing. The camera gun is rolling, capturing the images that will later be analyzed by intelligence officers who will shake their heads at the sloppiness, at the desperation, at the complete breakdown of German operational discipline in these final days. But Hayes is not thinking about intelligence value. He is thinking about the .850 caliber machine guns in his wings, about the 325 rounds per gun, about the fact that he is alone over enemy territory with a target so perfect it seems like a hallucination. The mission parameters said reconnaissance only, but the mission parameters were written by men who sit in warm operations rooms and study maps, not by pilots who understand that wars are won not by following orders perfectly, but by recognizing when orders have become obsolete the moment the wheels leave the runway. Hayes banks left, checks his fuel, enough for 20 minutes of combat and the return flight, and begins his attack run. What happened in the next 11 minutes would become a case study in opportunity exploitation, in the transformation of a defensive reconnaissance mission into an offensive action of stunning unilateral aggression, and in the question that would haunt staff officers for decades afterward. When is a pilot authorized to change his mission based on targets of opportunity? And when does initiative become insubordination? To understand the significance of this moment, we must first understand the state of the Luftwaffe in April 1945, and the transformation that had reduced what was once the world's most formidable air force into a scattered collection of grounded aircraft, untrained pilots, and vanished fuel supplies. By the spring of the war's final year, Germany's air arm existed primarily on paper. The strategic bombing campaign had destroyed the fuel production infrastructure. The synthetic oil plants at Leuna and Pölitz, which had sustained the Luftwaffe through years of war, were now smoking ruins, pounded into rubble by waves of B-17s and Lancasters. What little fuel remained was hoarded for the jets, the Me-262s and R-234s that represented Germany's last desperate gamble for air superiority, while conventional aircraft were grounded across the Reich, parked in fields and forests and farm clearings, waiting for fuel that would never arrive. The 9 aircraft that Hayes discovered were part of this grounded fleet. Intelligence analysis conducted after the war, cross-referencing Hayes's gun camera footage with captured Luftwaffe records, identified them as a mixed unit. 4 Ju-88 reconnaissance planes from 001 BSF 122, 3 He-11 medium bombers from an unidentified training squadron, and 2 Ju-32 transport aircraft. They had been dispersed to this field 4 days earlier as part of a general evacuation from their primary base near Leipzig, which was under threat from advancing Soviet forces. The plan had been to refuel them and fly them west to airfields beyond the Elbe, where they might be surrendered intact to the Americans rather than captured by the Russians. But the fuel never came. The ground crews had fled or been reassigned, and so the aircraft simply sat, immobile monuments to a collapsed logistical system, waiting for someone to remember they existed. The German ground commanders who had ordered these aircraft dispersed had expected American reconnaissance flights. They happened daily, predictable as clockwork, high-altitude photo runs that could be tracked and anticipated. What they had not expected was a lone fighter pilot who would deviate from his mission, who would see opportunity in a foggy clearing and transform observation into annihilation. The German military mind, trained in the Prussian tradition of rigid adherence to orders and doctrine, could not easily conceive of this kind of tactical freelancing. Orders were orders. A reconnaissance mission was reconnaissance, not ground attack. The Americans, they believed, were creatures of procedure and protocol, bound by their elaborate systems of command and control, incapable of individual initiative that contradicted their assigned tasks. They were catastrophically wrong. Hayes began his first attack run from the north, coming in low and fast with the sun behind him. Basic fighter tactics, executed perfectly against targets that could not shoot back and could not run. He lined up on the first Ju-88, centered it in his gun sight, and pressed the trigger. The 850s opened up with a sound like tearing canvas amplified 1,000 times, and the recoil shook the Thunderbolt like a truck hitting a pothole. 2-second burst, 60 rounds. The Ju-88's fuselage sparkled with impacts, then erupted in flames as tracers found the fuel tanks. Hayes pulled up sharply, banked right, and came around for the second aircraft. The sound of the .50 caliber Browning machine gun is one of the most distinctive in military history. A deep, hammering roar that announces American presence with unmistakable authority. Each gun fires at roughly 800 rounds per minute, and when 8 of them fire simultaneously, the noise is less a sound than a physical force, a percussion that rattles teeth and shakes internal organs. But more than the physical sound, the .50 caliber represented something symbolic in the arsenal of American air power. It was not the largest gun, not the most sophisticated weapon system. The Germans had 20mm and 30mm cannon that delivered more explosive power per round. But the .50 caliber was reliable, abundant, and devastating in volume. American fighters carried thousands of rounds because American industry could produce thousands of rounds, could ship them across oceans, could ensure that every pilot had more ammunition than he could reasonably expend in a single mission. The sound of those 8 guns firing was the sound of industrial abundance translated into combat power. Hayes moved methodically down the line of parked aircraft, working from north to south, setting each machine ablaze before moving to the next. The Ju-88s burned with particular intensity, their aluminum airframes providing no protection against the incendiary rounds that Hayes was mixing with armor-piercing ammunition. The He-111s took longer, their older construction techniques giving them slightly more resistance, but they too eventually succumbed, their fabric control surfaces igniting first, then the fuel spreading the flames to the main structure. The two Ju-52 transports posed a different challenge. These were non-combat aircraft, old tri-motor workhorses that had been flying since the Spanish Civil War, carrying troops and supplies across Europe for nearly a decade. Hayes hesitated before engaging the transports, a hesitation visible in the gun camera footage, where the crosshairs waver over the first Ju-52 for several seconds before the guns fire. These were not bombers or fighters. They represented no offensive threat, but they were military assets, capable of moving troops or equipment, and Hayes had already committed to the attack. The logic was inexorable. 9 aircraft destroyed was better than 7 destroyed, and 2 left operational. So he burned them too, watching the corrugated metal skin of the Ju-52s peel away under the hammer of his guns, watching the flames consume the last remnants of German air transport capacity in this sector. The entire engagement lasted 11 minutes from first burst to final confirmation pass. Hayes expended approximately 1,800 rounds of ammunition, roughly 69% of his total load. All 9 aircraft were destroyed or burning beyond repair. No German fighters responded. No flak batteries engaged. Hayes's Thunderbolt suffered no damage. He filmed the burning aircraft from multiple angles, documenting the destruction with the same methodical precision he had used to create it, then turned west and headed for home. Arriving back at his base, near Weimar, at 7:21 hours with enough fuel remaining for one more landing pattern. The intelligence debrief lasted 3 hours. The operations officer wanted to know why Hayes had deviated from the reconnaissance mission. Hayes explained that he had completed the reconnaissance. The bridge photographs were on film, and then engaged targets of opportunity, as he had been trained to do since flight school. The operations officer pointed out that the mission briefing had explicitly stated reconnaissance only, no engagement. Hayes pointed out that the mission briefing had not anticipated finding 9 undefended enemy aircraft sitting in the open, and that failing to engage such targets would have been a dereliction of duty. The operations officer noted that Hayes had acted without authorization and outside mission parameters. Hayes noted that by the time he had requested authorization and received a response, the fog would have closed in, and the opportunity would have been lost. The argument was never fully resolved. Hayes received neither a commendation nor a reprimand. His mission report was filed, his gun camera footage was sent to intelligence, and the matter was allowed to fade into the chaos of the war's final weeks. But the footage circulated among the other pilots, and the story spread. And within days, every fighter squadron in the 9th Air Force had heard some version of the tale about the pilot who was sent to photograph a bridge and came back with 9 kills. The transformation this incident represented was profound but subtle. It was not about tactics or technology. It was about the fundamental relationship between orders and initiative, between the mission as briefed and the mission as executed, between what commanders expected their pilots to do and what pilots believed they were authorized to accomplish. The American military had always existed in tension between these poles, the desire for centralized control and coordination versus the recognition that battlefield conditions changed faster than orders could adapt, that the man on the spot often understood the situation better than the commander miles away in a headquarters tent. Hayes's action forced a reckoning with this tension. If pilots were to be strictly bound by their mission parameters, then opportunity would be lost whenever it appeared outside those parameters. But if pilots were given too much freedom to freelance, then coordination would collapse, and forces would be scattered across the battlefield pursuing individual initiatives rather than coordinated objectives. The question was not whether Hayes had been right or wrong. Clearly, destroying 9 enemy aircraft was a good outcome. The question was whether his decision-making process could be trusted, whether other pilots in similar situations would make equally sound judgments, or whether Hayes had simply been lucky that his deviation from orders resulted in success rather than disaster. The German ground forces, who later discovered the burning aircraft wreckage, confronted a different kind of transformation. They had expected these machines to be their salvation, their escape route to the West, their ticket to surrender to the Americans rather than the Soviets. Instead, they found charred skeletons of aluminum and steel, still smoking when the first ground troops arrived to investigate the flames. The sight reinforced a narrative that had been building through the final months of the war, that the Americans possessed not just material superiority, but something harder to quantify, something that manifested in the aggressive opportunism of pilots like Hayes, who did not simply follow their orders, but actively sought to expand their missions, to find targets, to press the attack, even when their formal instructions told them to simply observe and return. This aggressive opportunism stood in stark contrast to late-war German doctrine, which had become increasingly defensive and cautious. Luftwaffe pilots in April 1945 were flying under severe restrictions: conserve fuel, avoid engagement unless necessary, preserve aircraft for a final stand that everyone knew would never come. The initiative that had characterized German fighter tactics in the early war years had evaporated, replaced by a grinding defensiveness born of material scarcity and strategic hopelessness. German pilots were still skilled, still brave, but they were no longer allowed to take risks, no longer authorized to deviate from their assigned missions, no longer trusted to make opportunistic decisions. The system had become rigid in proportion to its desperation. The contrast could not have been more complete. Hayes, operating in an environment of material abundance, was able to expend nearly 2,000 rounds of ammunition on a target that had not been part of his original mission, confident that more ammunition would be available for his next flight. German pilots, operating in an environment of material scarcity, hoarded their ammunition and fuel, flew only when absolutely necessary, avoided combat when possible. The American system encouraged initiative because it could afford the costs of failed initiatives. The German system discouraged initiative because it could not afford any wastage, any deviation from the optimal allocation of resources. But this economic calculus missed a deeper truth. The sound of Hayes's .850 caliber guns hammering those parked aircraft represented more than just the expenditure of ammunition. It represented a philosophy of warfare that prioritized action over preservation, offense over defense, opportunity over caution. Each 2-second burst was a statement. We have enough bullets to destroy targets, even when we were not specifically ordered to destroy them. We have enough fuel to extend missions beyond their planned parameters. We have enough aircraft that losing one to ground fire or mechanical failure while attacking a target of opportunity is an acceptable risk. We have enough of everything that we can afford to be aggressive, to take chances, to turn reconnaissance into assault whenever the situation permits. The Germans had started the war with this same philosophy. The Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 and 1940 had been exercises in aggressive opportunism, in pushing forward wherever gaps appeared, in exploiting tactical successes into operational breakthroughs. But by 1945, that philosophy had been ground down by attrition and scarcity. The grounded aircraft that Hayes destroyed were symbols of this transformation. They sat immobile, not because they were damaged, but because the system that supported them had collapsed, because the fuel trucks did not come, because the ground crews had fled, because the orders to evacuate them had been issued but could not be executed. They were victims not of American firepower, but of German logistical paralysis. Hayes's 11-minute attack broke more than just 9 aircraft. It broke the assumption that reconnaissance missions were safe, that dispersed aircraft were hidden, that the Americans would follow their orders and not deviate from their assigned tasks. Every German commander who heard about the incident had to recalculate his defensive dispositions, had to assume that any American aircraft overhead might suddenly transform from observer to attacker, that nowhere was truly safe from aggression. This psychological impact was harder to measure than the physical destruction, but perhaps more significant. It created uncertainty, hesitation, the gnawing fear that the enemy was not bound by the same constraints and limitations that governed German operations. The gun camera footage from Hayes's attack, now preserved in the National Archives, runs for 17 minutes and shows the destruction in methodical detail. Each aircraft is centered in frame. Each burst is clearly visible. Each fire begins as a small flicker and grows into a consuming inferno. Modern viewers watching this footage might see only the mechanics of destruction, the tracers arcing toward their targets, the impacts sparkling against metal, the flames spreading. But to the intelligence officers who first analyzed this footage in April 1945, it represented something more profound, evidence of a tactical flexibility that the German military could no longer match, proof that American pilots were operating under rules of engagement that permitted, even encouraged, this kind of initiative. The analysis report filed by 9th Air Force Intelligence on April 15, 1945, noted that Hayes's action resulted in the destruction of reconnaissance and transport assets that would have been valuable to German forces attempting to coordinate their retreat. The report also noted that the attack had been conducted outside of formal mission parameters and recommended that future reconnaissance briefings include clearer guidance on engagement of targets of opportunity. This recommendation was never formally implemented. By the time it reached higher headquarters, the war in Europe was weeks from ending, and no one had the energy or inclination to rewrite doctrine for a conflict that was already won. But the informal lesson spread through the fighter community with the speed of legend. Other pilots, hearing Hayes's story, began to interpret their reconnaissance missions more aggressively, to see observation as merely the first phase of a mission that might expand into attack if circumstances permitted. Some of these expanded missions succeeded brilliantly. Others failed, with pilots shot down or aircraft damaged while pursuing targets that were not worth the risk. The decentralized nature of tactical aviation meant that there was no consistent policy, no universal standard for when to engage and when to observe. Each pilot made his own calculations, weighed his own risks, acted on his own judgment. This inconsistency would have been intolerable in the German military system, which valued uniformity and predictability, which wanted every unit to execute its mission in the same way, so that higher headquarters could coordinate operations with confidence that orders would be followed as written. But the American system, for all its bureaucratic procedures and detailed planning, had always contained space for this kind of improvisation. It was built into the culture, inherited from a frontier tradition that valued individual initiative, from a democratic ideology that trusted citizens to make their own decisions, from an industrial economy that could afford the inefficiencies that came with decentralized decision-making. Hayes flew 8 more missions before VE Day, all of them by-the-book reconnaissance sweeps with no deviations and no targets of opportunity engaged. His final wartime tally was listed as 9 ground kills, the aircraft destroyed on April 12th, plus 2 air-to-air victories from earlier missions. He was credited with no official commendations for the Elbe River action, but the gun camera footage was used in intelligence assessments of German logistical collapse, and later in training films demonstrating target identification and ground attack technique. After the war, Hayes remained in the Air Force, transitioned to jets, flew combat missions in Korea, and retired as a colonel in 1965. He rarely spoke about the unauthorized attack, treating it as a minor incident in a career that spanned 2 wars and 3 decades of service. But the pilots who flew with him remembered the story. It became part of squadron lore, part of the informal curriculum that taught young aviators what the official training manuals could not. That wars were won by men who understood when to follow orders and when to trust their judgment. That reconnaissance missions sometimes became attack missions in the span of a single decision. That the line between initiative and insubordination was drawn not by regulation, but by results. This was dangerous knowledge, the kind that could not be codified because it would undermine discipline. But it was also essential knowledge, the kind that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. The burned wreckage of the 9 aircraft remained in that clearing for months after the war ended, slowly disassembled by scavengers and weather and the endless work of rust. Soviet troops eventually occupied the area, and the wreckage was cleared away, melted down, turned into something else. Perhaps rebar for reconstruction projects, perhaps components for Soviet aircraft. The physical evidence of Hayes's 11-minute rampage vanished into the general destruction of post-war Germany. But the gun camera footage survived, preserved in archives, occasionally viewed by historians researching the air war's final days, a silent testament to the moment when a pilot assigned to photograph a bridge instead destroyed 9 aircraft because he could. Because they were there, because the opportunity demanded it. The sound of the .50 caliber, that deep, hammering roar, echoes across the decades. It is not just the sound of mechanical destruction, but the sound of a philosophy made audible, that abundance enables aggression, that material superiority permits tactical freedom, that the nation which can afford to expend 2,000 rounds of ammunition on a target of opportunity is the nation that will win the war not through superior doctrine or better training, but through the simple mathematics of overwhelming force, applied wherever and whenever circumstances permit. The Germans understood war as an art, a contest of wills and tactics, where superior planning and execution could overcome material disadvantages. They built elegant doctrines, trained superb soldiers, executed operations with precision and discipline, but in the end, they could not overcome an enemy that treated war as an industrial process, that poured resources into the conflict with such abundance that tactical excellence became irrelevant, that enabled pilots like Hayes to shoot first and justify later because ammunition was cheap and opportunity was fleeting and the cost of restraint was higher than the cost of action. There is a larger truth embedded in this moment, in the unauthorized attack, in the burning aircraft, in the gun camera footage that documented destruction that was never supposed to happen. It is the truth that freedom, at its core, is about the space between orders and execution, the gap where judgment lives, the moment when the individual decides whether to follow the plan or adapt to reality. Hayes was free not because he lacked orders, but because his orders were loose enough to accommodate his judgment, because his commanders trusted him enough to tolerate deviation, because the system he served valued results more than compliance. The grounded German aircraft were the opposite, immobilized by a system that could no longer make decisions, could no longer authorize action, could no longer trust its own personnel to do what needed doing without explicit orders from higher authority. They sat waiting for fuel that would not come, for orders that could not be executed, for a system that had collapsed under the weight of its own rigid hierarchies. And then Hayes arrived, authorized only to photograph a bridge, and in 11 minutes demonstrated what freedom actually meant when translated into combat power. The freedom to see opportunity and seize it, the freedom to exceed orders when circumstances demanded it, the freedom to press the trigger 8 times 60 rounds per burst and transform reconnaissance into annihilation, because that was what the moment required, and no briefing officer 3 hours ago could have predicted or authorized or prevented. The sky over the Elbe has long since cleared. The fog that concealed those 9 aircraft has burned away under countless dawns. The bridge has collapsed and been rebuilt, and serves today as a crossing point for commerce and tourism, unmarked by any monument to the violence that once swirled around it. But the lesson endures, written not in stone, but in the gun camera footage, in the mission reports, in the stories passed from pilot to pilot across generations. That initiative, even unauthorized initiative, is the currency of victory. That freedom is not just a political ideal, but a tactical advantage. That the sound of 850 caliber machine guns hammering targets that were never supposed to be engaged is the sound of a military system that trusted its pilots enough to let them make their own decisions, take their own risks, and live or die with the consequences of their judgment. And in that trust, imperfect, inconsistent, sometimes rewarded and sometimes punished, lay the true source of American victory, more fundamental than industrial production or technological innovation or strategic planning. The trust that the man in the cockpit, looking down at 9 parked aircraft through the morning mist, would make the right decision even when that decision contradicted his orders, even when that decision could not be justified until after it succeeded, even when that decision transformed a quiet reconnaissance mission into an act of unilateral aggression that destroyed enemy assets and altered tactical calculations and announced, in the unmistakable language of burning metal and expended ammunition, that the Americans were not bound by anyone's expectations about what reconnaissance missions were supposed to accomplish.